Good afternoon. Today, I'll be discussing Joseph Smith versus Brigham Young in the sense of their views on the federal government. Quickly, I'll give an overview on Joseph Smith. So he was born in the early 1800s to a deeply religious household. The views of his family definitely affected the way that he viewed the federal government and the states' rights and state government, and also his religious views. Um, One thing that's interesting about Joseph Smith is that his spiritual views changed and shifted over time. Obviously, he had a miraculous event that happened to him when he was 14, 15, and he had different spiritual events in his life up until when he died in 1844. And his spiritual views and doctrinal views changed and shifted, and he taught that. And it didn't seem to matter to him if he taught something one week and then taught something totally different the next week. It seemed that he was just teaching what came to him. His political views weren't quite as inconsistent or open, but he did have shifting political views as well. One thing about Joseph Smith is, as he was born in um, New England area and lived in different parts, he had a strong sense of American exceptionalism. The um, he viewed the sorry, I forgot the words. He viewed the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence as divinely inspired. I almost said Doctrine and Covenants. He viewed those as divinely inspired and a gift from God, and he believed that the founding fathers were inspired by God. And this um, viewpoint seemed to permeate to the rest of the members. One important thing about Joseph Smith is that he viewed religious freedom as a high priority, even though he did believe that, yes, his church was the true church. In his presidential run, religious freedom was something that he emphasized and was important to him. And it's also something that I think he was criticized as he was going to start a theocracy or a theodemocracy. And I can see inklings of that with like the Council of 50. But I think as I've read different things about him, it seems like he was very keen on religious freedom. So Brigham Young was a little different. He was not quite as how do I say this? He was not his viewpoints on the federal government didn't necessarily change as much, but he was politically contradictory in the sense that he kind of did everything Joseph Smith said and wanted until Brigham became the prophet, and then he seemed to have a totally different viewpoint. So it was kind of gave off a sense that he wanted to please Joseph Smith, and when Joseph Smith was gone, he viewed it as a shot to give his own views and teach his own views, and especially with politics, he didn't necessarily follow the same plans and viewpoint that Joseph Smith did after Joseph's death. Before Joseph's death, he fell right in line, kind of was a company man, and but when he had his chance at power, he definitely changed things up. So he viewed whites as the superior race, which is important because Joseph Smith was not like that. As far as we know, Joseph was more of a he wanted to abolish slavery, and we'll get to that. His means for that were different over time. But Brigham had no intent of necessarily voting to abolish slavery, and he was definitely pro-slavery until up until his death. Obviously, slavery was abolished before he died, but he definitely believed whites were the superior race and thought slavery was biblical and used scriptures to justify it. One interesting about Brigham Young, obviously he led the church for more than 4 decades, so his political views did shift over those 4 decades, um, kind of trying to meet the needs of the people. So real quick, we'll go over Smith's views of the federal government. So while the Saints were in Missouri and Governor Boggs gave them an extermination order, there was a last-ditch attempt to reach out to the president at the time looking for help. So Joseph kind of looked to the federal government as a means to help them get their property back, to stay on their land, and for protection. So that's kind of evidence that he did look upon the federal government favorably. He didn't necessarily receive the help that he wanted, but he did at least have hope that they would be able to help them. And they kind of did help the Saints in the sense that they, with the Mormon battalion, and they worked out a compromise so that the Saints would go, or some of the men would go fight in the Mexican American War. So there was a compromise that was reached, and the federal government did help them out, but not quite in the way they were looking for. So, as I mentioned before, Smith viewed the Constitution as divinely inspired. He believed in expansionism, so he did believe that the United States would reach from sea to sea, kind of that, I forget the name of the doctrine, manifest destiny, I guess, similar to Thomas Jefferson. And he thought the country would move out west, and it was definitely not necessarily colonialism, but was interested in expanding. So his views on slavery did shift and change. At first, he was completely pro-abolition, get rid of slavery as soon as possible. But if you look at what he wrote in his campaign documents about slavery, he was open to abolishing slavery gradually. I think he set a goal to abolish slavery by 1850, which was, obviously before the Civil War. So if he had been elected, I think that's something he would have moved forward with. But he also wanted to compensate the slave owners in a way where they aren't just losing their property and losing their assets. So he didn't want to just cut it right away. He was open to compromising, but it was a goal of his to move to abolish slavery. So I guess these next 2 points are consistent with his presidential campaign and kind of make him unique from the later Latter-day Saints, is that he did believe in a strong federal government. He believed that that states should have rights, many rights, but also that they should have a strong federal government to kind of bind them together. And he did support a central banking system, which was controversial at the time, and that did set him apart from other, let's say, religious/political leaders. So Brigham Young's view of the federal government, like I mentioned earlier, he was pro-slavery. He used biblical verses to justify it. And the majority of what I could find about Young's view of the federal government came from his time when he was governor of Utah. And he definitely wanted Utah to be its own country. Originally, it was called the state of Deseret, the desert kingdom, kind of which stretched from south from San Diego, touching the Pacific Ocean all the way up through southern Idaho and into Colorado and Nevada. And he wanted that to be kind of its own country. And at the least, he wanted it to be a territory that was in the United States, but not necessarily governed by the United States. So he served as governor of the Utah Territory originally, and he interacted with President Lincoln, and he wrote President Lincoln a letter saying, like, can you just leave us alone? And President Lincoln wrote back and said, I'll leave you alone if you leave me alone. It's kind of a little interesting interaction that happened, and that seemed, at least during President Lincoln's lifetime, that seemed to be what happened. There are instances where Brigham Young and the Saints were breaking the law as far as polygamy and bigamy and other things, and President Lincoln decided not to enforce the law. Unfortunately, President Lincoln was assassinated, so other presidents didn't quite see things the same way, but at least during President Lincoln's time, the federal government and Brigham Young got along well. Young was definitely more pro-states' rights. He believed in a smaller federal government. I think he envisioned a time when Utah would become a state, so he wanted as many states' rights as possible. He also held isolationist views in the sense that he wanted the territory of Utah to be isolated, but also I think he believed that the United States should not be meddling in foreign affairs. And obviously he didn't live long enough to see the time when they'd be involved in World War I and World War II, but I think those isolationist views held over to the federal government as well. So let me just go over some quick similarities before we hit the differences. Is Brigham and Joseph, they both were pro-religious freedom, even though Brigham ran a theocratic democratic government while he was in Utah. And I think people thought if he was elected president, he would also kind of run a theocracy or a theo-democratic government. But they were very pro-religious freedom. However, Brigham showed that less while he was in Utah. I think both were motivated to protect the saints. And they just did that in different ways. I think Joseph Smith was motivated to protect the saints by running for president and saying, if we can't get the help, I'm just going to do it myself. And to protect the saints. And Brigham was more, I just want to stay away from everyone to protect the saints. Both had high political aspirations. Joseph Smith was obviously running for president at the time of his death, and Brigham Young was the governor of Utah. Both intertwined politics with God, and they believed God could resolve the political issues of the time. And that's an interesting one, to mix doctrine and politics. This second to last point is interesting. It goes kind of over to this quote on the right side. I'll just read the quote. It says, "Even this nation will be on the verge of crumbling to pieces and tumbling to the ground. On the constitution on the brink of ruin, this people will be the staff upon which the nation shall lean, and they shall bear the constitution away from the very verge of destruction." So it's kind of interesting that they both believe that the Mormon people and the saints would be what saved the Constitution from dangling by a thread. There's another quote that says, the Constitution will dangle by a thread, and then a kind of a white horse will come in and save it. And many saints and Brigham Young and Joseph Smith believe that the Mormon people or a Mormon leader would be that white horse that would come in and save the Constitution when hung by a thread. And that viewpoint perpetrates to this day. When Mitt Romney was running for president, I remember people said, oh, he's the white horse that'll come in and save the Constitution. And that's just interesting to see how that belief still permeates. So it's interesting. Young supported Smith in his run for presidency. Young was obviously in the first presidency, one of the apostles, and he supported Joseph in that run, which is interesting when we get to the next slide, because they definitely a lot of differences in how they reacted to the federal government. So a couple key differences. I think just overall, Smith wanted to integrate with society, and Young wanted to be a peculiar and isolated people. I think Smith realized they were different, but he wanted to appeal to the masses, and he kind of wanted to desensationalize Mormonism. When Young was okay with being weird, he just wanted to be weird and alone, I guess. So Smith wanted aid from the government, which at one point when Young was going west, he also wanted aid from the government, but Young mostly wanted to protect himself from the government. Smith was an open-minded leader, and Brigham was an authoritarian leader. So I think Smith was open to change and discussion, when Brigham was more, my word is law. And you can kind of see that as Brigham was over the church for longer, he definitely became more and more what I say goes. This one's probably not worded the best, but Smith was a visionary who seemed to disregard consistency. He was open to a changing views. Like I said, his sermons, one week he might say one thing, and the next week he might say something else. And Young, even though he was politically contradictory in the sense that he supported Joseph Smith, and after Joseph Smith died, he kind of had some total shift in his views. Young was more consistent in the sense that when he said it, he was going to roll with it. When Smith was like, I said it, but I'm okay with changing my mind, I guess. And you can see that with Smith's view on slavery. And then another key difference is Young thought the federal government was out to get the Mormons because of the open polygamy, which was true. The federal government was kind of out to get the Mormons when they were out in Utah. But during Smith's lifetime, he kind of was trying to hide polygamy in order to kind of appeal to the masses, put up this front like, hey, we're just, we are the one true church, but we're like you and me. We're different, but we want to integrate with society. So here are my sources. Take a look for a second.